My parents hid my brother's affair with my wife. What happened at the baby shower will leave you stunned. Hey Reddit, I'm Ryan, and my life feels like it's been turned upside down. In the span of one afternoon, everything I thought I knew about my family was shattered, leaving me questioning every relationship I've ever had. Before I get to the explosive moment that unraveled it all, let me give you a bit of background to understand how we got here. I come from a seemingly close-knit family. My parents, Margaret and Henry, have always been the kind of people who pride themselves on appearances. They've been married for over 30 years, hosting elaborate family dinners and making speeches about the importance of love and unity. To anyone on the outside, we probably seemed like the perfect family. I'm the oldest of two siblings. My younger brother Jake was always the golden child. Charming, athletic, and effortlessly charismatic, he had a way of making people gravitate toward him. Growing up, Jake could get away with almost anything. If he got into trouble, my parents would smooth things over. If he broke a rule, they'd find a way to justify it. Meanwhile, I was the dependable one, the straight-laced, reliable older brother who followed the rules and avoided rocking the boat. Despite our differences, I never resented Jake. I knew what to expect from him, and I thought I'd learn to live with the fact that he had a knack for charming his way out of situations. But what I didn't realize was just how far his selfishness could go, and how much damage it would cause when it finally came to light. 5 years ago, I met Sarah, the woman who I thought was the love of my life. She was kind, smart, and grounded, with a quiet strength that drew me in. We hit it off immediately, and within a year, we were married. Sarah fit seamlessly into our family, and my parents adored her. Even Jake seemed genuinely happy for us, though he'd occasionally make offhand comments that bordered on inappropriate, things like how lucky I was to have landed someone like Sarah. I'd laugh it off, not thinking much of it. Our marriage was good, or so I thought. But about a year ago, things started to feel off. Sarah grew distant, often preoccupied or glued to her phone. She'd brush off my attempts to connect, saying she was tired or stressed. At first, I chalked it up to the natural ebb and flow of marriage. Every couple goes through rough patches, right? Then came the pregnancy. When Sarah told me she was expecting, I was overwhelmed with joy. It felt like the answer to everything, a chance to bring us closer together, to start the family we had always talked about. My parents were thrilled, already planning a lavish baby shower. Jake was over the moon as well, joking about how he'd be the fun uncle. But as happy as I was, something still didn't sit right. Sarah's distance didn't disappear with the pregnancy, if anything, it grew worse. She avoided my touch, found excuses to stay busy, and seemed almost nervous whenever Jake was around. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, telling myself I was overthinking things. The baby shower was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of joy and togetherness. My parents spared no expense, decorating their house with pastel balloons, a catered spread of food, and enough gifts to fill a nursery. Sarah seemed happy for the first time in weeks, smiling as guests congratulated her. Jake was his usual self, cracking jokes and playing the role of the charming younger brother. But beneath the surface, I couldn't shake the tension I felt. Something about the day felt wrong. The turning point came when it was time to open gifts. Sarah and I sat in front of a pile of neatly wrapped presents, thanking each guest as we tore into the packages. Everyone was laughing and smiling, the atmosphere light and warm. But then I reached for a small, plain box wrapped in brown paper with no card attached. At first, I thought it was a joke gift. Maybe a friend trying to be funny. But when I opened the box, the room fell silent. Inside was a stack of photographs. The first few seemed harmless enough, Sarah and Jake talking at a family gathering, sitting together at a holiday dinner. But as I flipped through them, my hands started to tremble. The images became more intimate. Sarah and Jake together at a bar, laughing and leaning in close. Sarah and Jake holding hands. And then, the final blow, Sarah and Jake in bed together, unmistakably tangled in a moment of intimacy. The last item in the box was worse. It was a printed copy of a paternity test, the results glaringly clear. Jake was the father of Sarah's baby. My hands went numb, and the room spun around me. The photos slipped from my grasp and scattered onto the floor, where they were quickly scooped up by shocked and curious guests. Gasps and whispers rippled through the room as the reality of what they were seeing sank in. I looked at Sarah, who was frozen in place, tears streaming down her face. Jake stood across the room, pale and wide-eyed, his usual charm nowhere to be found. And then there were my parents. Their reactions were the most telling. They didn't look shocked. They didn't look confused. They looked guilty. It hit me all at once. They had known. My parents had known about the affair, about Jake and Sarah, and had chosen to keep it a secret. Worse, they had welcomed Sarah into their home for this baby shower, celebrating a pregnancy they knew wasn't mine. The betrayal was staggering, and something inside me snapped. The chaos that followed was a blur. Guests shouted at each other, my parents tried to grab the photographs, and Sarah crumbled into hysterics. But what happened next was something no one could have predicted, a moment of violence that would leave my family forever fractured. The baby shower erupted into chaos. Voices clashed, chairs scraped against the floor as people moved to get a better look, and the tension in the room became almost suffocating. My parents were the first to act, lunging for the scattered photographs, their faces etched with panic. My father, who had always prided himself on being calm and composed, looked wild-eyed and desperate as he tried to gather the damning evidence. My mother hovered behind him, wringing her hands, and stammering something incomprehensible. It was clear they weren't shocked, they were scrambling to contain the damage. Sarah was still sitting beside me, frozen in place, her face streaked with tears. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. I didn't need to hear her excuses. The photos and the paternity test told me everything I needed to know. Jake, on the other hand, was a stark contrast. He stood at the edge of the room, pale but upright, his hands clenched into fists. His usual cocky demeanor had vanished, replaced by a tense, almost defiant energy that made my blood boil. And then it happened. One of the guests, my cousin Eric, who had always been protective of me, picked up one of the photographs and held it aloft for everyone to see. His voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his tone sharp with anger. The room fell silent again, all eyes turning toward me, Jake, and Sarah. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, and my hands trembled as I stared at the photo Eric held. It was the one of Sarah and Jake in bed together, their betrayal immortalized in glossy, high-definition clarity. It was my father who broke the silence. He stepped forward, his voice shaking as he tried to explain. "Ryan, listen, this isn't what it looks like. We were just trying to protect." Protect. That word snapped something inside me. Protect who? Protect Jake? Protect Sarah? Protect themselves? They hadn't been protecting me, not when they kept this disgusting secret, not when they allowed me to plan for a future with a child that wasn't mine. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Don't," I said, my voice low but shaking with rage. "Don't you dare try to justify this." Before I could say anything else, Eric, bless his reckless nature, took it upon himself to confront Jake. He crossed the room in 2 strides and shoved him hard in the chest, sending Jake stumbling back into a table, covered in gifts. Boxes toppled to the floor, but Jake didn't fight back. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes darting between me and my parents as if calculating his next move. The tension boiled over when one of Jake's closest friends, who had also been invited to the shower, tried to intervene. He stepped between Jake and Eric, telling everyone to calm down, but Eric wasn't having it. He swung at Jake's friend, and suddenly, the room erupted into a full-blown melee. My parents screamed for everyone to stop. Sarah sobbed uncontrollably. Guests either rushed to intervene or backed away in shock, their faces pale with disbelief. And me? I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as my entire life fell apart in front of me. Amid the chaos, I noticed something strange. A few of the guests, family members who had always been close to my parents, weren't reacting with shock or confusion. They weren't yelling or trying to intervene. Instead, they looked guilty. Avoiding eye contact, staying in the background, as if they were already aware of what had come to light. It hit me like a ton of bricks. My parents weren't the only ones who knew. The realization left me dizzy. How far did this conspiracy go? How many people had known about Jake and Sarah's affair and said nothing? How many of them had smiled at me, congratulated me on the pregnancy, and lied to my face? As the brawl continued, I turned and walked out of the room. I needed air, space, something to stop the walls from closing in around me. My ears rang with the sounds of shouting and crashing behind me, but I didn't look back. Outside, the cool evening air hit my face, but it did little to calm me. My mind raced with questions and anger. Who had sent the anonymous gift? Someone in that room had wanted the truth to come out, but why now? Why this way? And what did they stand to gain from blowing everything apart? I didn't have answers, but one thing was clear: I couldn't let this go. The betrayal ran deeper than I had imagined, and I needed to uncover the full extent of it. My family had made me a fool, and now they owed me the truth, whether they liked it or not. But as I stood there, staring at the horizon, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see my father standing in the doorway, his face pale and lined with stress. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his usual confidence stripped away. He opened his mouth to say something, but I raised a hand to stop him. "Don't," I said, my voice steady but cold. "Not here. Not now. We're going to talk, but you're going to tell me everything. Every single thing. And if I find out you're still lying..." I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. The look on his face told me he understood. Inside, the shouting had died down, replaced by the murmur of shocked guests gathering their things to leave. The baby shower, this grotesque mockery of a celebration, was over, but the storm it unleashed was just beginning. The aftermath of the baby shower was like being trapped in a pressure cooker. The room may have gone quiet after the chaos subsided, but the tension that lingered was suffocating. No amount of damage control from my parents or apologies from Sarah could erase what had just been revealed. My family, the people I thought I could trust above all else, had been complicit in the most devastating betrayal of my life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my head: my mother's panicked face, my father's half-hearted attempts to grab the photographs, and Jake standing there with that mix of fear and defiance, as if he thought he could still somehow get away with it. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself. It was the realization that so many people in that room had known about it. My parents. Jake. Sarah. And, as I was starting to piece together, more of my family than I could stomach to admit. By the time the sun came up, my anger had crystallized into something else: determination. I wasn't going to sit back and let them decide when and how I got the truth. They had already stolen my trust, my relationship, and the future I had envisioned. Now, I was going to force them to come clean about everything. I showed up at my parents' house unannounced that morning. My father answered the door, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept either, but I didn't care. My mother hovered behind him, clutching a mug of coffee like it was her lifeline. Neither of them said anything as I stepped inside, but their nervous glances at each other told me they knew why I was there. Once we were in the living room, I didn't waste any time. I demanded answers: how long they had known, why they had stayed silent, and who else in the family had been in on the secret. My tone left no room for negotiation. At first, they tried to hedge. My father kept starting sentences with "it's complicated" or "we didn't want to hurt you," but I wasn't having it. I pushed harder, my voice rising as I told them to stop lying. Finally, my father let out a long sigh and sank into his armchair. "We've known for a while," he admitted, his tone flat and emotionless. "Sarah came to us first. She was scared, Ryan. She didn't know what to do. Hearing her name from his mouth made my stomach turn, but I stayed silent, letting him continue. She admitted the affair to your mother, and we thought it would pass. We thought Jake would come to his senses and end it. You thought it would pass? I snapped, my voice trembling with rage. How the hell does something like that pass? My father didn't answer, his face pale and weary. My mother finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. We thought we were protecting you, she said. Protecting me. Those words echoed in my head, making my blood boil. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting Jake. They had made the deliberate choice to let me live in ignorance, to build my life around a lie, because they didn't want to face the consequences of Jake's actions. But there was more. When I pressed them further, my father hesitated before revealing something that made my blood run cold. Jake hadn't been an innocent participant in this betrayal. He hadn't just fallen into an affair with Sarah by accident. According to my father, Jake had been jealous of my relationship with Sarah from the start. He had always wanted her, and the affair wasn't some moment of weakness, it was calculated. The room spun as I processed his words. My own brother had coveted my wife, pursued her, and ultimately betrayed me in the most personal way possible. And my parents had known all along. But the worst revelation was still to come. When I demanded to know who else in the family knew, my father faltered again. His hesitation made my stomach twist. Finally, he admitted that they hadn't been the only ones in on the secret. An aunt. A cousin. Even my grandmother. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. These were people who had hugged me, congratulated me on the pregnancy, and looked me in the eye while knowing the truth. They had chosen to stay silent, either out of loyalty to my parents or because they didn't want to get involved. I couldn't stay in that house a second longer. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor, and told my parents I was done with them. They tried to call after me as I walked out the door, but their words fell on deaf ears. But even as I drove away, my anger burning like a fire in my chest, one question kept nagging at me, the anonymous gift. Who had sent it? It wasn't my parents. They had been desperate to keep the secret buried. And it wasn't Sarah or Jake, they had the most to lose from the truth coming out. That left someone else. Someone in that room had wanted the truth to come out, but the question was, why? Was it an act of kindness, someone trying to save me from a life built on lies? Or was there another motive? I started to think back to the faces at the baby shower, the way people had reacted when the photos spilled onto the floor. Some had been shocked, genuinely horrified. But others had looked guilty. There were a few family members who hadn't said a word the entire time, who had quietly slipped out after the chaos began. The more I thought about it, the more I realized they had probably known. But had one of them sent the gift? Or was it someone else entirely, someone I hadn't even considered? And then another thought crossed my mind, one that made my blood run cold. What if the person who sent the gift wasn't trying to help me? What if they had their own agenda, something even more sinister? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear, the betrayal ran far deeper than I had imagined, and I wasn't done uncovering the truth. The ride home from my parents' house felt like a blur. I could barely see the road through the haze of anger, confusion, and betrayal, clouding my thoughts. My parents' admission had left me reeling, but it was the unanswered questions that truly haunted me. The anonymous gift. The photographs. The paternity test. Someone had deliberately chosen to detonate the truth in the most public and humiliating way possible. Whoever it was, they knew everything. The thought made my skin crawl. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just a personal betrayal by Sarah, Jake, and my parents. Someone had been watching, documenting, and waiting for the perfect moment to drop this bombshell. I spent the rest of the day poring over the details in my mind, trying to figure out who could have sent the gift. It had to be someone in the family, or at least someone close enough to know about the affair and the pregnancy. But why wait until the baby shower? Why choose a moment of celebration to air everyone's dirty laundry? The next morning, I decided to retrace my steps. I went back to my parents' house, not to confront them again, but to gather more information. They had been hesitant and evasive when I pressed them about who else might have known about the affair. But this time I wasn't leaving until I had answers. My mother answered the door, her face weary and lined with stress. She didn't even try to pretend everything was fine. She just stepped aside and let me in without a word. My father was in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and staring into the middle distance. When I asked about the gift, their reactions were immediate. My mother's eyes widened, and she glanced nervously at my father. He froze for a moment before setting his mug down with a sharp clink. "We don't know who sent it," he said, his voice unusually firm. But his tone didn't convince me. "You're lying," I shot back, my voice cutting through the quiet of the room. "You knew about the affair. You knew about the pregnancy. Someone sent that gift to blow everything up, and if you don't tell me who, I'll find out myself." My father sighed, running a hand over his face, and for a moment, I thought he might actually confess. But then my mother spoke up. "We honestly don't know, Ryan," she said, her voice trembling. "But, we have a suspicion." She hesitated, her eyes darting toward my father as if seeking his permission. When he gave a small nod, she continued. "There's been tension in the family. Some people weren't happy with how we handled things. We think it might have been your Aunt Linda." Aunt Linda. My mother's older sister. She had always been outspoken, unafraid to call people out on their behavior, no matter how uncomfortable it made things. If anyone in the family would blow the whistle on something this explosive, it would be her. But why now? And why anonymously? I left my parents' house with more questions than answers, but Aunt Linda was my next stop. She lived a few towns over, so I called her on the way to let her know I was coming. She didn't sound surprised to hear from me, but there was something in her tone, a mix of hesitation and resignation, that put me on edge. When I arrived, she greeted me with a warm but wary smile. Her house was as meticulously kept as ever, but I couldn't help noticing the tension in her posture as she led me to the living room. I didn't waste time beating around the bush. "Did you send the gift?" I asked, my voice steady but demanding. Her reaction was immediate. Her face fell, and she let out a long sigh as she sank into the armchair across from me. "No," she said, shaking her head. "But I know who did." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't speak. "It was your cousin Danielle," Aunt Linda continued. "She's the one who found out about Jake and Sarah. She told me months ago, but I told her to stay out of it. I said it wasn't her place to interfere." Danielle. My younger cousin, someone I'd always been close to growing up. She was quiet, observant, and fiercely protective of the people she cared about. I couldn't believe she had known about the affair and hadn't said anything to me. But more than that, I couldn't understand why she would choose the baby shower to expose everything. When I asked Aunt Linda why Danielle had done it, she hesitated. "She wanted to protect you, Ryan," she said finally. "She didn't think you deserved to live in the dark, building a life around lies." But what?" I pressed. Aunt Linda looked away, her expression heavy with guilt. "But she also wanted to punish Jake and Sarah. She was angry. She thought they were getting away with it, and she wanted them to feel the consequences of what they'd done." The pieces were falling into place, but they painted a picture that left me reeling. Danielle hadn't just exposed the truth for my sake, she had done it out of anger, vengeance, and a desire to see Jake and Sarah humiliated. Her actions may have brought the truth to light, but they had also unleashed a wave of destruction that couldn't be undone. I left Aunt Linda's house feeling a strange mix of gratitude and betrayal. Danielle had done what no one else in my family had the courage to do, but her motives weren't entirely pure. She hadn't just wanted to protect me, she had wanted to watch the fallout. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Danielle. "We need to talk." Danielle's text felt like the final piece of the puzzle, clicking into place. "We need to talk." It wasn't a plea for understanding or an offer to explain herself. It was a statement of intent, and I could tell she had more to say. Whatever her reasons, whatever truth she held, I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear it. But I didn't have a choice. This wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about everyone who had betrayed me, everyone who had chosen silence, and the one person who had broken it in the most dramatic way possible. When I arrived at Danielle's apartment, she was waiting for me, leaning against the doorframe with a tense expression. Her usual quiet confidence was still there, but there was an edge to her demeanor, a weight that hadn't been there before. She ushered me inside without a word and gestured for me to sit. "I know you're angry," she began, her voice steady but measured. "And you have every right to be. But before you say anything, I need you to hear me out." She didn't wait for me to respond. Instead, she launched into an explanation that unraveled everything I thought I knew about my family. Danielle hadn't stumbled onto the affair by accident. She had seen Jake and Sarah together months ago, their interactions too close, too intimate to be mistaken for anything innocent. She hadn't confronted them directly, but she had started paying attention, noticing the little things, the way Sarah avoided my touch, the way Jake's eyes lingered on her just a second too long. At first, she told herself it wasn't her business. But then she overheard a conversation between Jake and Sarah at a family gathering. They hadn't seen her, tucked away in the corner, and their whispered argument had made everything clear. Sarah was already pregnant, and Jake was panicking about what to do. Danielle had wanted to tell me immediately, but she hesitated. "My parents," she explained, "had a way of making you feel like you were wrong for questioning them." When she brought it up to my mother, hoping to force her hand, she was met with deflection and guilt. My mother had begged her to stay quiet, insisting that telling Ryan would destroy him. "And maybe I should have," Danielle said, her voice cracking slightly. "Maybe I should have gone straight to you. But I didn't know how. I didn't know if you'd even believe me." So, she waited. She bided her time, watching as my parents, Jake, and Sarah continued the charade. But when the baby shower was announced, she saw her opportunity. "I didn't send that gift to hurt you, Ryan," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "I sent it because you deserved to know the truth. And because Jake and Sarah deserved to have their lies exposed." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I wanted to argue, to yell, to tell her that what she had done had made everything worse. But as much as I hated to admit it, she was right. I did deserve to know the truth. And without her, I might never have found out. But there was something else, something darker, that Danielle had been holding back. "I didn't just do it for you," she admitted finally, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I did it because of Jake. Because he's been doing this for years." My stomach turned as she explained. Jake's affair with Sarah wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern. Over the years, he had pursued multiple women in the family's circle, some married, some not. He thrived on the secrecy, the thrill of taking what wasn't his. And my parents? They had always known. Every time Jake crossed a line, my parents had smoothed it over, sweeping his behavior under the rug to protect the family's image. They had done it so many times that Jake no longer feared the consequences. "You were supposed to be different," Danielle said, her voice trembling. "You were supposed to be the one person he couldn't touch. But when I saw what he was doing to you, I couldn't stay silent anymore." The weight of her words hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about Sarah, or the baby shower. This was about years of complicity, years of enabling Jake's destructive behavior, years of protecting the golden child at everyone else's expense. And it was over. I left Danielle's apartment in a daze, my mind racing with everything she had revealed. The truth wasn't liberating, it was suffocating. My family's betrayal ran deeper than I ever could have imagined, and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, I cut ties with everyone. My parents tried to reach out, but I ignored their calls and texts. Jake made no attempt to contact me, and I didn't care. Sarah, too, was silent, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved in with Jake. The thought of them together, raising a child that should have been mine, was almost too much to bear. But I refused to let their actions define me. I threw myself into work, therapy, and rebuilding my life. Slowly but surely, I began to find my footing again. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but it became easier to bear. And Danielle? She remained a complicated figure in my life. I couldn't forgive her completely, not yet, but I couldn't hate her either. She had done what no one else had the courage to do, even if her motives weren't entirely pure. In the end, I realized that the only way to truly move forward was to let go. Not to forget, not to excuse, but to let go of the anger and betrayal that had consumed me for so long. Because sometimes, the hardest truth is the one you don't want to face. Family isn't always your safe haven. Sometimes, they're the ones who hurt you the most. But the pain they leave behind doesn't have to define you.